abstain. I'm joined now by two members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, just back from meetings with Ukraine's new government in the country's capital of Kiev, Democratic Senator Durbin of Illinois and Republican Jeff Flake of Arizona. Welcome to both of you. Nice to have you here in the studio after a long trip, so I appreciate you being here.
Good to be here.
So, look, I'm operating, Senator Durbin, on the assumption that Crimea is gone, effectively, that this vote moves forward and it's into Russia's orbit. So what's the plan to change Putin's calculation, to either get him to reverse this or to stop where he is?
Well, first, this election or referendum is a lame excuse by Putin to invade Crimea and take it over. You know, when you move in thousands of Russian troops from Sochi Olympics to garrison their positions in Crimea, then have these masked gunmen with automatic weapons and no insignia roaming the streets. What a delightful election atmosphere. This is a Soviet-style election. We know what the ending is going to be. And now the West has to decide. Not just the West, but the civilized world has to decide whether we're going to do anything to stop
so what's
Putin's
the
designs.
thing? But what's the thing?
Well, there are plenty of things we can do, and the president is working now to put together an agenda. We passed, Jeff and I are in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, we passed a measure 14-4 bipartisan measure last week that provides not only economic assistance to Ukraine and the possibility of IMF loans coming their way with reform, but also some very serious sanctions against Russia for its conduct.
What about military aid to Ukraine? I mean, does that have to become a bigger issue? Are you for it? Does the Ukraine need more military support to hold off Russia if it were to move into the eastern part of the country?
Their military has been hollowed out over the past couple of years. They have, according to some Ukrainians, we have nothing that shoots, runs, or flies. And it's because the Russians have had such close ties with the previous government that they hollowed the military out. So yes, they need a lot of help, but nothing that we can do will help Ukraine withstand what Russia is going to do if they decide to go into.
But what if Russia decides not to? What if they get the successful vote, it becomes part of Russia, and then they say, okay, that's it, we'll have a truce, we're not sending any more troops in. Is that an acceptable status quo?
From my point of view, no. I mean, they have invaded.
So the sanctions would still go, asset freezes?
So they've invaded a sovereign nation.
Yeah.
And if we are going to stand by and let them do to Ukraine what they've done to Georgia, the Republic of Georgia 8 years ago, then, you know, you can expect more.
But Senator Flake, can you reverse that with economic penalties?
You know, possibly. It's going to be difficult. Let's face it. Russia has always had its design on Crimea. It considers Crimea part of Russia. And so that's going to be difficult, but all you can do is increase the cost significantly and hope that they don't move further into Ukraine.
All right, so to that point,
difficult.
Is eastern Ukraine a red line for the United States?
Well, certainly we've got to move in hard now with sanctions, regardless of whether they move tomorrow or the next week or hold back. We're going to move forward with sanctions, not just us, but our European allies as well.
You know, when we deal with Vladimir Putin, this issue of hypocrisy comes up, and the United Nations spoke of this week. The United Nations pointedly criticized the U.S.'s human rights record over drone strikes, NSA surveillance, the death penalty. Does it make it hard to deal with the likes of Putin and Lavrov when you've got the UN criticizing the U.S. that way?
Listen, there are plenty of imperfections in every government of every nation, but look at what we have here. Putin, this is I think the single most serious act of aggression since the Cold War. He ended up the final ceremony at the Sochi Olympics, which your network covered, trying to make a charm offensive for the world that this is a modern Russian nation. And within hours, he's invading one of his neighbors, sending the same troops that were protecting the athletes at Sochi into the Crimea. Now, are we going to stand by and say this is acceptable conduct? Because this isn't the end of his ambition. He'll go as far as we let him go.
But how do you change the calculation?
Well,
that's what I still don't see.
Speaking of the UN, what's important is what happened yesterday when the U.S. and the Security Council, with China actually abstaining, not siding with Russia, actually voting to condemn what happened. That's important. What resolutions in the General Assembly or whatever are less important, certainly, and there's no way you can have some moral equivalency of what Putin is doing and what we've done in the past.
Another foreign-note before I ask you a couple of things domestically, and that is Syria. NBC News devoted a great deal of coverage to the untold suffering of the children of Syria in this refugee crisis. On the heels of that, Congress has taken action, moving to, as you did, Senator Durbin, with your name on it, pushing for more humanitarian aid. But the reality is, as this moves into its fourth year, those children in Syria, those refugees, are not going to be helped unless something is done to stop Assad. Can anything besides some sort of military intervention do that?
First, let's focus on refugees and children. I'm glad NBC did. 2.3 million was one estimate that I've read, that close to accurate. The United States has absorbed so few of these families. We have to be more welcoming and open to help these families transition into a safe place in their lives. Then comes the political question. What can we do in Syria to change what's happened there for several years? And it is a quandary. You know, trying to find the right opposition force that will stand by us and effectively fight against Assad has been a challenge. Many of the opposition forces are not friendly to the United States. So let's be careful. The allies we choose, let's support them as best we can so that we put pressure on Assad to end the killing.
Senator Flake, the president 2 years ago said Assad's days were numbered. How did he misjudge it?
Well, I think we do have a problem when you have somebody willing to draw red lines that nobody has a problem stepping over. And so I think that was a miscalculation, and it could have been handled better. Now, I'm not suggesting that we could end the suffering there or would have ended it all or future suffering, but I think we could have done a better job with our policy.
But this is the ultimate thing with Russia as well. Conservatives, Charles Krauthammer, calling it Obama's fruitless accommodationism. Does it invite Russia's Putin to take the action he's taken, or Assad to feel like he's got more staying power when the president doesn't follow through in Syria?
Mr. Krauthammer has a short memory. Do you realize what happened in the Georgia Republic under President Bush? Virtually the same thing that's happening in Crimea. Putin went in there and seized territory and held it. Now, what does Mr. Krauthammer say of the Bush administration in those days? And as far as our policy in responding to Putin's aggression, there's a basic question here. What will the bipartisan Congress do to support the president's actions? When the president asked for just the authority for military action to stop chemical weapons in Syria, it was hard to get. In fact, we couldn't achieve it on the floor of the House or the Senate. We couldn't get a bipartisan consensus behind foreign policy.
I voted to give the president that authority.
You did.
I've been critical of the president in the past, but I don't think anything the president did or said lended itself to what Putin did here.
Just a few seconds left. Do you both believe the CIA illegally spied on the Senate?
I have the highest respect for Dianne Feinstein. There isn't a person in the Senate who works harder to be bipartisan and fair with one of the toughest assignments as head of the Senate Intelligence Committee. I read her statement she gave on the floor. It was a thoughtful, serious effort to establish the role of Congress and the Senate in the oversight of the CIA, and I am...
Did it illegally spy on the Senate?
Well, I can tell you this. I don't know the particulars, but we need to get to the bottom of it, and I've called on the administration and the CIA to release this report once and for all so we know what happened.
But my question is, did the CIA illegally spy on the Senate? Are you prepared to reach a conclusion?
Dianne Feinstein believes that's the case. I'll stand behind her, but let's get the investigation underway.
Should Brennan apologize?
I'm not prepared to say. I'm not on the Intel Committee. There's a lot of confusion surrounding it, so I'll wait until they do their investigation.
All right, I'll leave it there. Senators, thank you so much. Appreciate you being here.